Hi, everybody. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. We're going to talk about globalization and class and global inequality more broadly. Not sure what's happening in my neighbor chart, but it distracted me. All right, let's go ahead and start this slideshow. Nope. All right. So globalization is broadly just talking about how we are not centered around just national trade or trade in prospects that are close in geographic region to us anymore, but really that social and economic relationships really are stretching again across the globe, right? We're doing this in a very, very big way. And we're doing that through the use of technology. We're doing that through the use of specifically communications technology, travel technology, any kind of distribution networking. Anything like that has made it possible for a more global scaled market. So it has produced a large variety of opportunities amongst certain nations who are front runners in that or who handle specific kinds of specific parts, we'll say, or hire the people of specific parts of the market in order to obtain a large deal of wealth because their buying community was no longer just a specific community, but now was a much larger network. But it also increased widespread poverty. Stop that. Widespread poverty and suffering. And by that, it means that somebody had to get the brunt end of the low end labor jobs. Somebody had to get the low end or more hard labor jobs. Somebody had to do the mining for more resources. And some of the places that do or house these resources were exploited in ways including exploitation of the people. In ways that produced a great deal of global inequality. And we'll kind of get into that more as we move on. We're influenced by organizations and corporations that have social networks that, again, are wide and varying and aren't just operating out of one specific country, but are operating off of numerous ones and are housed in numerous parts of the globe. A key part of the study of globalization is the emergence of the world system, or for some purposes, we need to regard the world as forming a single social order. And really what this means is that not only do we have like those national hierarchies, sorry, apparently the kids next door are playing, those national hierarchies and those community hierarchies or more local hierarchies, we're also going to have this global hierarchy as well that are going to format people in very different levels of playing field. So global inequality is the systemic differences in wealth and power among different countries. And we'll get into how that plays out for the people of those countries too, because there will be possibly some wealthy people within those lower income countries, but that would be more due to, again, networking or specific kinds of privileges that they may have while also still being part of or selling off the resources of their particular countries. And so there's going to be some elite, some people in the hierarchies that are going to sell off their labor, sell off their people, sell off all of these kinds of things in ways that create their country to be in peril while they may be doing okay themselves as rulers or leaders of those specific countries. Sociology aims to really talk about inequality and how they can overcome it in a very broad sense. But we also have sociologists who work in every different country, and we have sociologists that work on topics within different countries and regions and ones that work on things in very global perspectives. So because we have a very micro and macro lens, it allows us to study everything from the two-person interhuman interactions to these large global scale systems. Even the wealthiest countries, again, have growing numbers of poor people, but there's still a huge difference between the poverty that is experienced, say, in America and the poverty that is experienced and some of our more what is considered a third world country, or some of our more impoverished countries. Just a second. Yep. All right. Not sure why that stopped. Let me fix this. Having some technical difficulties. All right. So we're going to talk about the different classifications of really what poverty means in terms of sociology. So when you classify countries based on income, that can be misleading because it doesn't account for maybe some of the cost of living or kind of some of the other factors that lead to poverty. So absolute poverty is when a person cannot acquire the basic life needs such as food, shelter, water, clothing, those kinds of things. And relative poverty is really when persons are poor relative to the other people within their society. So someone can be maybe relatively poor, and so they can be poor to comparatively in a relatively wealthy country and still have more than those who are maybe in much higher brackets in some of the less wealthy countries. And so that kind of just differentiates how that works out. When measuring human development, the UN estimates twice as many people in poverty as when measuring by income alone. When we talk about these different measures, right, we're going to have a different set of data. We're going to have a different amount of information coming in. It's going to be a lot more fruitful and a lot more helpful to us when we try to more accurately find ways to measure these things. One way to classify countries in terms of inequality is to compare the wealth produced to the average person, right? So this is essentially what you're gonna look at is essentially what all that country brings in for profit due to the resources that it either sells off and or to the products that it sells off or to the labor that it sells off. And it's going to take all of that and then it's going to account all that money up and then say, okay, the country makes this much money and there's this many people that live in it. So per capita, that country is going to make on average this much. And that's going to be able to give us kind of a more global scale country by country as to how the countries are doing. The problem with that is when you have some of these countries where they have billionaires, quadrillionaires in there, that's not gonna, or like say Saudi Arabia. So the Saudi royalties going to offset that in really bizarre ways. That's going to make that income distribution increasingly disproportionate. So the gross national income, again, is that commonly used measure based on income earned for the country versus, again, the number of people. The World Bank uses this to classify countries in their income hierarchy for our global hierarchy. However, again, it has its own issues we were just mentioning. High income countries are generally those that were industrial first. So they were the ones that were part of the market system as a seller prior to some of the other ones. And that's going to be countries like Europe, North America, the East Asian Pacific region, China, some of those countries. High-income countries are home to 16% of the world's population, but they command 63% of the world's total gross income. So when you think about that, that's also not necessarily saying that that's transferring to all those people. But what it's also saying here is that those countries are also housed to some of the biggest corporations, to some of the headquarters for some of those biggest industries. And in having that, it's going to throw off some of those income distributions. And so that's something to think about as we're working on this and really thinking through how these concepts really impact humans that live within these countries. Middle income countries are those that began to industrialize later, maybe in the 20th century and later in the 20th century than the higher income countries. They're primarily found in East and Southwest Asia, and they include oil-rich countries in the Middle East and North Africa. They house 5% of the world's population, but only account for 36% of the output produced in 2018. So again, think about this, the middle income, and you're thinking about places within the Middle East, within North Africa, that have a very rich amount of resources. But again, is that income transferring to specific people, to specific industries, to specific corporations, to specific entities that house or obtain the money for that particular thing? Or is it getting back to the people for which reside in those countries? And that's something that's going to be not necessarily equally, it's not going to be accurately representing how those countries are really, how wealthy those people in those countries are. So low-income countries are most agricultural economies and are some just beginning to industrialize. Low-income countries house 9% of the world's population, but only 0.1% of the gross national income. The inequality between the average annual income in high-income countries and low-income countries is increasing due to differences in population growth. So what that's saying essentially is that your lowest of the low in the low income countries and the highest of the high in the high income countries, that gap is exponentially growing. And the more that grows, the more both those countries that house those richer countries, those countries and that house the higher of the population, and those that operate on those lower income are going to have not just resource scarcity differentials, they're also going to have means opportunities differentials. They're going to have infrastructure differentials. They're going to have all these things that are required in order to gain opportunities within the global market are going to be significantly lessened as that gap between the higher income countries and those lower income countries really remains significantly disproportional. All right, so what it's like, health. People in high income countries are far healthier than their counterparts in low income countries, whereas the health care facilities, sanitation, water, and food supplies are inadequate. So it makes sense that if you're struggling for your bare minimals, food, shelter, water, clothing, and even that might be toxic depending on where you're getting your water, or maybe your sanitation for your housing is possibly not even existent, right? So depending on what all of those things look like, you're going to have a very different set of health concerns. You're going to have a very different set of health priorities. You may not even have health priorities if your main priority is to go get water and figure out where you're going to find water, figure out where you're going to find your next meal, figuring out if you have shelter. Also, something that has massively impact those particular, the health and welfare of on a global scale is the rise in natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes. All of those things are going to hit your low income countries, and their infrastructure is going to struggle significantly more. Their ability to provide resources are going to be significantly lessened. All of their mortality rates in these disasters are frankly going to be, because they don't have systems to necessarily make people aware. All of these things are going to increase the disaster itself and its human toll and its economic toll based on essentially that lack of being able to have some of the things that maybe in higher countries or even here in the US we would take for what are my words, they're not there today, would essentially like just not consider as something that everybody wouldn't have. So you're not going to have, say, your nightly news. Maybe you're not going to have your communications or even radio in some places. You're not going to have basic running water, electricity. It's something that as we watch, say Hurricane Ian ravage Florida right now, we're going to be thinking about kind of how fast that infrastructure gets put back, how fast those healthcare facilities or healthcare crisis within those those disasters can be justified. All of that aid is going to get there much quicker in this country, even than, say, Puerto Rico, who also got hit, or in Cuba, who also got hit. You know what I mean? So these things will greatly depend on where the country is economically and what their level of resources are. Low-income countries have higher child mortality rates and lower life expectancies, but these numbers are improving. There are global efforts. There are global measures to, say, deal with disease spread, to deal with global epidemics and pandemics. The COVID-19 disaster, pandemic and disaster is another example of where we realized how tied as a global network we really are, and how fast things can spread through our global networks just based on the fact that there is so much access and so much travel within those within our global community. The number of chronically undernourished people has declined leading up to 2015, but has since increased. And that's just saying that essentially we were doing a much better job about trying to figure out how we were going to fight hunger on a global scale. And as here in the last going on close to a decade, we've seen that severe weather, that conflict in different regions, wars, things of that nature are creating very real hunger crisis for a lot of people globally. And these things create malnutrition for not only adults, but it's, again, hunger disproportionately impacts children. And that's because if you can't feed yourself, you can't feed those kids either. And when you have things like war and conflict areas and such of that nature, you end up with a lot more children who don't have adults that are looking after them or looking for their next meal in ways that maybe they didn't have to worry about prior to conflict in the region, or so on. We also end up having a lot more conflict, also produces a lot more immigration. It produces a lot more refugees, and that in and of itself is going to take up a large portion of global resources. And if the global atmosphere isn't surrounded on how we can help those refugees in those terms of crisis, then there's a lot of people that end up with very little aid and very little resources to make sure that they survive. So again, malnutrition also has to do with technology and food costs. It also has to do with the ability to keep up with the prices in a global market for food. Food can be very expensive depending, and once you deplete a region's resources or water or ability to grow, then that particular region is very limited on what they can do about their hunger situations without the aid of a global network. And so that creates, again, much more variance on how hunger is actually not treated, how hunger is given aid, depending on what country you're in. Education and literacy. So high-income countries can afford to spend more money on education than low-income countries, resulting in more literate adults. Education is important because it contributes to economic growth. It can help decrease poverty, and it can lead to a more viable job ability. It also leads to having fewer children, which slows kind of population growth in those very resource scarce areas that might be struggling with being able to accommodate its growing population. Child labor in most low-income countries. Children are forced to work because of a combination of family poverty, lack of education, and traditional indifference. Most working children labor in agriculture. The rest are in manufacturing, wholesale and retail trade, restaurants and hotels, and a variety of other services, including working as servants in wealthy households, and or mining, and or some other more dangerous activities that, say, would be illegal in most wealthy countries. The children in more low-income countries are limited in their abilities to just be kids, to just be able to learn, to just be able to play. And those limitations are generally due to economic inequalities. All right. So emerging economies or developing countries such as India or Singapore, which over the past 2 or 3 decades have begun to develop a strong industrial base. Inequality within those countries, which has declined during the 20th century, began to rise again when globalization of manufacturing began to take off, particularly in countries of more neoliberal economic policies. The United States, inequality has returned to what it was a century ago. That is huge. And that's just really talking about the fact that those things are growing because as we have this more global scale, maybe those capitalist ventures or those corporations that would have done manufacturing jobs here in the US decided that the labor policies, the lack of safety protocols and what have you makes it cheaper to do it in lower income countries, where they can take advantage of the population and maybe only pay them 20 cents an hour, or pay them $3 an hour, or pay kids to do it instead of adults because they don't have to worry about safety protocols or what have you. And because of that, the US has lost a lot of its lack of education based jobs that made possible the really boom after really the world wars. On top of that, the massive amount of infrastructure rebuilding that was taking place in US industrial areas and making the parts to up the infrastructure that had been destroyed in those wars in Europe is now really over. And so in doing that, the US really isn't having to, or isn't really, their role is shifting. And if the US doesn't figure out how to make itself again a more viable resource and figure out how to pull more jobs into its populace that maybe isn't as educated and or educate its populace, then you end up with a situation where it doesn't keep up with some of the other more wealthy countries. And that's not to say that it's not still a wealthy country, because it is. But part of the reason it is, and part of the reason inequality is growing so much, is because that the wealthiest of the wealthy that are here in the US are generally corporations, or those who are the admin or above, are the CEOs or above of those of those corporations. And that creates a very big disconnect between those that maybe just work in that company, or the janitor in that company, or are the people that maybe run the front desk or what have you. Those people aren't going to be steadily increasing in the same ways that CEOs and the company's profit margins are. And so that does create a massive disconnect. And that disconnect ends up having a long-term implications for the country's economic health. The East Asian emerging economies, they were really part of colonial relationships that took, though they imposed many hardships, they helped to pave the way for economic growth. East Asia region benefited from a long-term period of world economic growth between the 1950s and the mid-1970s. And they grew the growing economies of Europe and the United States provided a big market for manufacturers in East Asia. And again, they were taking advantage of the fact that their infrastructure was not damaged as much in some of those wars. And so allowing that to make way for them to be part of a global economic factor as a seller in very big ways gave a multitude of opportunities for those countries to become more wealthy. Economic growth in this region took off really at a high point during the Cold War, when the United States and its allies, in an attempt to erect a defense against communist China, provided these countries with generous economic aid that fueled investment in new technologies. And so as those new technologies grew, their ability to really, take off economically was really there, and it was really there for the first time in big ways. Some have argued that cultural traditions, including shared Confucian philosophy, contributed to these economic advantages as well. So these are kind of some of the terms and some of the ways in which sociology contributes to this conversation about the global market. We talk about neoliberalism, which is the economic belief that free market forces, and the belief that free market forces achieved by minimalizing government restrictions on business will provide the greatest economic benefit to the widest range of people. And so there are neoliberalists within. Abby, no, thank you. No, Abby, you need to get back to school. Get to it. Yeah. Sorry. But so this particular brand of thinking is really talking about the fact that the more that governments kind of stay back, the more the economic market is going to determine who makes it and who doesn't. But in doing that, it doesn't factor in how many countries, how many people, how many industries end up monopolized and end up with really big corporations owning, to an extent, a large portion of a lot of lower income countries' resources and the wealth that is made from those resources. And so that's something that needs to be thought of when we're talking about these kind of policies. By the mid 20th century, countries recognized that when left unregulated, markets could favor the rich and powerful. And that's not just when it comes to countries. That also means the rich and powerful that lead the corporations and that lead particular industries. And it led to reoccurring economic crises and produced a wide gap between the rich and the poor. The United States later pushed neoliberalism again in an attempt to reduce communism in poor countries. It didn't necessarily work. It's still not working. Modernization theory is this version of neoliberal development theory that argues that low-income societies develop economically only if they give up their traditional ways and adopt modern economic institutions, technologies, and cultural values that emphasize saving and productive investment. So capitalism. Basically, modernization theory is really like, hey, your sustainability living, we don't like it, so let's get you into the capitalist market. And in doing so, we're going to tell you that your methods of production are inadequate, and are irrelevant. And so you need to get in with us and do this capitalist thing and do it in the way we say, or you're going to fall behind and we're going to take all your resources and then your system's not going to work. So it's a catch-22. It leaves them with no option because they either do things the way they've always done it, but they don't have the resource to do it because the capitalist system has already kind of scraped up all of those resources and put them into the market in other ways. Or, hey, we're going to sell you very little for your resources and give you very little for those, and you're going to either make it or not, and that's up to you based on how much you can save. You can't really save because the market's not bent on actually making it so that you as the little person can do that, because I'm going to make you pay for all these resources that you used to use in your sustainable practices. And it creates this really negative and conflict-oriented kind of structure in between lower and higher income societies. So dependency theories are Marxist theories of economic development that argue that the poverty of low-income countries stems directly from their exploitation by wealthy countries and by the corporations that are based in those wealthy countries. So again, essentially talking about this idea that those countries and those who run those countries are really scraping out all of those resources and then wondering why those countries don't have more to sell or are not making enough to develop further in their in their economic growth. Core, according to the dependency theory, core describes the most advanced industrial countries, which take the lion's shares of profits in the world economic system. And the periphery, which is really describes the countries that have a marginal role in the world economy and are thus dependent on those core countries and their trading relationships. So these core countries are these ones that are industrialized earlier that really are the higher ups of the market, house these major corporations, and they come in and they're like, hey, we'll make you this deal that you're going to give us these resources that we ultimately need to keep our economy going, but we're going to pay you this for it because in your market that's really good, but in our market it's like nothing, right? So, and it creates this unequal distribution because then all of a sudden they get thrown into this market that with those similar prices, and they're completely different than what their standard or price or profit margin was supposed to be built around. And we'll kind of get into that more, I think. Dependency theory saw this relationship as a downward cycle in which countries, poor countries profit off the expense of impoverishing those other countries. Such exploitatory relationships became the major force of colonialism. And colonialism is this process whereby Western nations establish their rule in parts of the world away from their home territories, which includes the destruction of cultural means, economic systems, sustainability practices, language systems, religious systems. It essentially is saying we are going to wipe you out and assimilate you culturally and economically, and we are going to make you assimilate into our cultural and economic belief structures in order for you to survive, and you may not. Or the version of you is going to be assimilated into our culture. And the view of dependency theory, global economic inequality, was ultimately backed up by force, right? So all of colonialism is based on not kind practices. This is going in and essentially disrupting people, killing people, rape, pillaging, and plundering. Different purposes of the world as we, as white folk from Europe, explored or what's the word? As we found these new lands. These lands were already had people on them. They already had systems on them. They already had cultures on them. But in these developing countries, through colonialistic processes, essentially went in and were there to wipe out these particular threats to acquire the resources that those areas might obtain, or they might obtain through those areas. Dependent development is this theory that poor countries can still develop economically, but only in the way shaped by their reliance on the wealthier countries. And that again is tied into this like much lingering colonialistic ideologies, right? And those have shaped and molded the way economic relationships have been made, and the way in which countries continue to interact. We'll go with that. Global commodity chains are worldwide networks of labor production processes that extend from raw materials all the way to the final country or consumer. So this is going to be, you get your raw materials, those raw materials get refined, those refined materials get made into parts, those parts get made into items, those items get shipped out to markets, those markets are distribution centers, and those centers ship them out to particular stores in particular communities, and then the consumer comes in and buys those, right? That's typically how that's going to work out. Corporations in high-income countries outsource their manufacturing to factories in lower-income countries to reduce costs and avoid environmental restrictions and or safety protocols and or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The semi-periphery are those semi-industrial or middle-income countries that extract profits from the form of cheap labor and raw materials from these countries, while at the same time providing labor and raw materials to core industrial countries. So they're taking from the lesser, the lower income or the lesser economically stable places, extracting those resources and maybe creating maybe they're extracting the raw materials and they're taking those raw materials and refining them, or maybe they're doing part of the distribution center process. They're taking some step in the middle of this process essentially and saying, hey, they're not our raw materials and they're not our final products, but we're going to make more money than those places that had the raw materials are the lower income countries, because we are emerging into these markets, but it's still not economically we're taking advantage of somewhere generally in order to get our little bit of a leg up, and we're still not making it to those wealthier, more industrialized societies that are the heads of those corporations, et cetera, et cetera. And these are going to include places like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and some of those emerging economies in East Asia. The world systems theories is pioneered by Emanuel Wallerstein. This theory emphasizes the interconnectedness of countries based on expansion of capitalist world economy. This economy is made up of core, semi-periphery, and periphery countries. So essentially what Wallerstein did was talk about Marxist theory and kind of shimmy it up a little, make it prettier, and make it more relatable and more understandable on a global system scale, right? So Marx was really good at looking at capitalism in industrialized societies, or even looking at how maybe particularly Europe was looking and connecting it to its little areas. But at the time in which Marx was really talking about these things, the interconnectedness or globalization process was still in its infancy. And so really having these conversations later on, Wallerstein really wanted to be like, hey, let's have these conversations now that this is a really big deal and this is an everyday part of life, as this global network is really increasing due to the internet and what have you. And the world systems theory really argues that strong governments do not necessarily interfere with economic development, but rather they play a key in promoting it. And doing that, they're saying that essentially in order to keep some kind of a market fair, they're going to have to intervene, because otherwise these lower countries are going to always be rooted in colonialistic kind of extraction practices. Slowly, the once powerful countries will lose their economic power over others. And in doing so, it's going to create a more economically feasible situation for all the countries. The theory of global capitalism argues that transnational capitalist class is increasing the major player in the global economy today, rather than nationally oriented capitalists or major countries. So really talking about, you're looking at transnational corporations as more of those who are really making the decisions in a very global perspective, are engaging in a lot of lobbying across those higher, well, really lobbying across the world governments and in the UN in ways that are creating and facilitating this economic hierarchy, and they're going to continue to do so. These transnational capitalist class really, again, is talking about those who have economic interest in the globe rather than a national level, and that they share a globalized perspective and similar lifestyles to those of cosmopolitan citizens of the world. So you're going to see this being that elite group of people that essentially are running, or those CEOs and above of those major corporations at a global level. So global capitalism is the current transnational phase of capitalism, characterized by global markets, production, and finance. The transnational capitalist class, whose business concerns are global rather than national, and a transnational system of governments such as the World Trade Organization that promote global business interests across that large space. Traits of transnational capitalist class. Its economic interests are global rather than national. Again, so this is that those who are making decisions are really looking at a globe. They're looking at the production process as a global process, as opposed to looking at it as, how am I going to get resources in this country, and then production in this country, and then distribution in this country, and then consumers in this country. It's looking at, hey, this is a global market, so I have buyers in this country, but I have sellers in this country and distributors in this country and raw materials from this country and labor from this country. And all of these things are going to piece together how it is that we're producing whatever that particular thing or product or service is. Members of transnational capitalist class share this globalized perspective, really, again, believing that in that free trade and oppose efforts of governments to regulate their activities. And why wouldn't they? Because essentially what they're looking for and what they're lobbying for is that ability to monopolize particular markets and monopolize the process in a way that limits their the things in their way and of their profits, and to maximize their ability to move around within all these different countries in ways that is the most economically feasible for them. This is not necessarily looking at the world. So when they say they're looking at this through a globalizing perspective, they're not saying yay, this is a world and we need to take care of everybody. We need to make sure everybody has access and everybody has opportunity. It's about saying, hey, these people don't have access and opportunity. So we're going to go in and give them maybe access to the internet, but only in doing that, we're going to use all of their labor power. And since they do not have the maybe opportunities to maybe even be part of their own government or have say in their own government, we're going to elicit this government to get rid of economic our ecological measures, safety measures, and so we're just going to dump toxic waste in their waterways. I mean, they'll be okay, and even if they're not, we've gained them access to the global market, so we've given them something, and they've in turn received something for that. So we've done something. So I want to be very clear that the members of this particular class, their goal is not for long-term global equality. It is for them to have a wide array of opportunities to limit their or expand, I guess, their profit margins and to limit their ability to really have governments get in the way of that. They share similar lifestyle. They foster exclusivity through schools, clubs, and gatherings, and they own multiple homes and travel in private jets. They're very disconnected from the average life of any people in any of these countries, especially the lower income countries. They feel they're cosmopolitan because they live similar lifestyles and span many countries. They see themselves as citizens of the world rather than citizens of any particular country. And that gives them this ability to kind of disconnect themselves from any particular country and or any particular governance. Neoliberal theories recommend the adoption of modern capitalist institutions to promote economic development. Dependency theories emphasize how wealthy nations exploit poor ones. World system theory analyzes the world economy as a whole, looking at it from this complex global web of political and economic relationships. And the theory of global capitalism really emphasizes the importance of an emerging and increasingly powerful transnational capitalist class, or this group of people that, again, is interplaying with all of these different nations and all of these different nation states people in ways that really are out for their own benefit and not necessarily the well-being of anybody but their particular profit margins. All right, so the future of global inequality. In one future scenario, our world might be dominated by large global corporations with workers everywhere competing with one another in one global marketplace, where average income worldwide might level out, or polarization between the haves and the have-not would likely cause conflict. In a more hopeful scenario, though, the benefits of modern technology could stimulate a worldwide economic growth, resulting in opportunities for all. Again, that still requires these transnational class to have some regulation and to have on a very on the forefront of those who are in more higher, I guess, economic growth countries to be willing to provide aid and to establish stabilizing measures of those lower income countries. And so we have to look, all the countries have to look at the world as a global economy and as a global network, and as something that requires all of us to be on even keel. And with the amount of conflict country to country, that becomes very, very difficult. One challenge to this theory gap is the technology gap, dividing the rich and the poor countries, and even the rich and the poor within those rich countries or within those poor countries. So those gaps increasingly get more dramatic. Slowing economic growth coupled with rising inequality has resulted in the emergence of far right nationalist parties, which has given rise to an extreme amount of disconnect between, those who are maybe wanting change to happen and the actual processes or big global picture that is resulting in their economic unfortunate outcomes. Further conflicts could displace millions, creating immigration. So economic problems resulting from climate change and a lack of really ecological safety measures have created violent conflicts in poor countries due to a lack of resources. And further conflicts could displace millions and create immigration challenges for places like the US and Europe. So there's a lot to this. There's a lot of different political entities. There's a lot of different moving parts that create this picture of global inequality. This is just scratching the surface and is like the bare minimum. But if there's something you are interested in, or something that really gets you excited about some of these things, I know that they used to offer a globalization class. I don't know that they still do, but they also, there's also many, many resources that I can get for you about any of these given topics. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, comments, or concern, and I hope you have a great week.